in Romans chapter 7, the Apostle Paul takes on the issue of the law versus the Spirit. And if you've read the first 6 or 7 chapters of Romans, you'll find that the Apostle Paul he's wrestling with this thing between the spiritual man and the carnal man. And he uses the expression in chapter 7. He says, "Oh, wretched man that I am." He talks about how that he desires to be released from this heart of sin that leads a person to sin. And then he asks another question in that chapter. He asks about the law and the necessity of the law. And he explains to us how that the law is important, because if it were not for the law, then we wouldn't even know what sin was. And so the law becomes our barometer. It tells us what sin is. And because God, as he laid these things out to Moses, he explained to us and revealed to us the very heart of God. But what Paul also tells us in this, he said, we're not going to reach that state of perfection before God because there is sin in our lives. And to have to be able to deal with this very nature of sin, because he explains to us that sin are sins of the flesh, and how that we allow ourselves to become disobedient to God in our flesh because we are being led by our flesh. And the flesh has that desire to rebel against God. And, of course, we find this even in the account of the story of the creation in the garden. And so, what he begins to explain to us here in chapter number 7, he said the law is not going to save you. But he actually tells us that the law is spiritual because it was given by the very heart of God. But the law, you'll find that the law will fail you if your heart is only desirous to follow the dictates of the law. And so the Apostle Paul says there's another law that is far greater than the law of obedience to written commandments. And that's the law of the spiritual inner man that has a quest to be in relationship with God the Spirit. And our heart is allowed to become dominated by spiritual leadership that comes from God, that will cause us to be in compliance with the heart of God, because it's God speaking and it's God's leading, and our obedience and our desire to come into harmony with that. You see, that's why I say it's not just my quest to want to do good things, but my quest to be in a right relationship with the true and the living God. It's Pastor Jack King with the gospel on the radio broadcast.